The snow came early that year. At first, it was only a storm that lasted longer than most storms. People watched it from their apartment windows and said it would pass. The city had seen snow before. It had seen worse. But the snow did not pass. It kept falling through the night and into the next day. The wind pushed it through the streets and against the glass towers. It gathered along the empty sidewalks and settled over the roofs of buses and cars that had been left where they stalled. By the third day, the roads were gone. You could still see the shapes of them beneath the snow, but the lanes had turned into pale rivers that wound through the silent buildings. The traffic lights swung slowly in the wind, their colors glowing faint through frost. No one drove anymore. The buses stopped first. The drivers tried to push through the drifts, but the engines choked and died. The tires spun and buried themselves deeper. Soon the buses sat still in the streets like frozen animals. After that, the cars stopped. Some people abandoned them when the roads became too thick with ice. Others simply ran out of fuel while idling in the cold. One by one, the vehicles went quiet until the whole city became a graveyard of machines. Snow covered everything. It climbed up the sides of buildings and buried the lower windows. It filled the intersections and swallowed the sidewalks. Street lamps bent under the weight of ice and hung low like tired men. The storm should have ended, but it did not. The weather stations spoke about it first. They said the jet stream had shifted and the air had turned strange. Satellites showed a great white mass of cold air stretching across continents like a spreading wound. The forecasts changed every hour. Meteorologists stopped talking about days and began talking about weeks. Still, the snow fell. Inside the towers, the heat struggled to hold. Power stations burned fuel harder than they ever had before. Gas lines froze in the suburbs. Electrical grids groaned beneath the demand of millions of heaters running at once. The city hummed with energy even while it slept. But the cold outside kept growing. You could see it in the way the river stopped moving. First, the edges froze. Then the middle turned gray and still. By morning, the whole river lay silent beneath a skin of ice. People gathered along the bridges and looked down at it. They did not say much. A frozen river meant something deeper than winter. Everyone knew that. On the sixth day, the snow stopped for a while. The sky cleared and a pale sun rose above the towers. It shone through a haze of ice crystals that drifted in the air. The light made the city look quiet and beautiful in a way that felt wrong. But the temperature kept falling. The cold cut through coats and gloves and bit at the skin. Breath hung in thick clouds that lingered long after people moved away. In the streets, the snow hardened. Drifts turned into ridges of ice that locked the cars in place. Buses sat half-buried beside the sidewalks. Their windows were covered with frost and their doors were sealed shut. No engines started anymore. The radio stations spoke of airports closing across the world. Cargo ships trapped in northern seas. Highways in Europe buried under meters of snow. The news anchors tried to keep their voices calm, but their eyes were tired. Somewhere far away, another storm had already begun. It was larger than the first. Scientists spoke about ocean currents slowing, about volcanic dust high in the atmosphere, about sunlight reflecting back into space from a growing sheet of ice spreading across the northern oceans. No one knew exactly why it was happening. They only knew it was getting worse. At night, the city grew very quiet. Without traffic, the wind moved freely between the towers. It carried fine needles of snow through the empty streets. Sometimes the sound of metal creaking echoed through the cold air as buildings shifted under the weight of ice. In the distance, a transformer exploded with a dull blue flash. For a moment, The skyline flickered. Then one whole section of the city went dark. People stood at their windows and watched the blackness spread across the towers. It moved slowly at first, then faster as the grid struggled to keep up. The lights blinked again. Another district went out. The silence grew heavier after that. From above, the city looked like something abandoned long ago. White streets wound between gray buildings. Frozen vehicles sat trapped beneath snow. A few windows glowed faintly where generators still ran. But most of the towers were dark. The cold settled deeper. And far beyond the city, across oceans and mountains and empty plains, the same winter was arriving everywhere at once. It was only the beginning. The world had not yet understood what had started. The highways filled with people. They did not leave all at once. At first it was only a few families who packed their cars and tried to drive south. They said the cold was worse in the north, and that the storms would follow the jet stream down across the plains. But the roads were already turning bad. Snow fell day after day, and the plows stopped coming. Fuel deliveries slowed. Trucks jackknifed across frozen highways and were left there like broken gates. Still, the people kept leaving. They walked when the cars failed. At the edge of the city, the interstate bridge curved out across the valley. It had once carried thousands of vehicles every hour. Now the lanes were buried beneath snow and ice. Cars and trucks sat frozen in long, silent lines. Wind moved through them like water through rocks. Some people climbed through the vehicles looking for food or blankets. Others simply passed by, pulling small sleds or plastic crates tied to rope. They moved slowly. You could see them from the hills above the highway, a line of dark figures walking across the white land. The cold bent their backs and kept their heads down. Most did not speak. Talking wasted breath. A man in a brown coat pulled a sled behind him. It was one of those small blue ones children used for winter hills. Now it carried 2 heavy packs and a metal cooking pot that rattled softly with every step. Behind him walked a woman and a boy. The boy stumbled often because the snow was deep and the cold had made his boots stiff. The woman held his arm each time he slipped and pulled him upright again. They had been walking for 3 days. They were not alone. All along the road, people came out of the city in small groups. Some carried backpacks. Others dragged suitcases that left thin tracks across the snow. A few pushed shopping carts filled with blankets and canned food. Every face looked the same, cold and tired. Above them, the power lines sagged beneath heavy ice. Towers leaned against the wind, and the cables hummed faintly like strings pulled too tight. Sometimes the lines snapped. When they did, the sound cracked across the valley like rifle fire. Far away, beyond the bridge, the city stood silent under the pale sky. Smoke rose from a few buildings where generators still burned fuel. But most of the towers were dark now. The electricity had failed in large sections 2 nights earlier. Without heat, many people had decided to leave. They said the southern states were still warm enough to survive. They said the farms there might still grow food. They said the ocean currents would keep the coasts from freezing. Nobody knew if any of it was true. But the rumors were stronger than the cold. So they walked. The highway bridge creaked under the weight of ice. Large spears of frozen water hung from the concrete like teeth. Wind blew through the broken guardrails and carried thin clouds of snow across the road. Below the bridge, the river had vanished. Where water once flowed, there was now only white ground, stretching between frozen banks. The ice was thick enough to carry trucks, though none were moving now. On the far side of the bridge, a communications tower stood covered in ice. Its metal arms were thick with frost, and the dishes that once pointed toward satellites were buried under frozen drifts. The tower still stood, but no signals moved through it anymore. A group of travelers stopped near the base of the structure. They rested beside an overturned van that had frozen into the roadside snow. One man broke pieces of wood from the van's interior paneling and tried to start a small fire. The wind kept killing it. Nearby, a woman knelt beside a crate and opened a can of soup with slow, careful hands. The metal lid made a thin scraping sound in the cold air. The people did not gather close to each other. They kept small distances, as if each person carried their own quiet space of exhaustion. Further down the road, the line of travelers continued across the frozen landscape. From above, they looked like dark stitches pulled across a sheet of white cloth. No one walked north. Every step led south. Sometimes someone would stop and turn to look back at the city. The towers were small now against the pale mountains and the long sky of winter. They looked distant and empty, a place that no longer belonged to people. The man with the blue sled stopped once near the middle of the bridge. He turned slowly and watched the skyline for a long time. The wind lifted snow around his boots. Then he faced the road again. He pulled the rope tight and continued walking. Ahead of him, the highway curved south through a valley buried in ice. Beyond the hills, there were other towns, other highways, and millions of people making the same journey. They moved across the frozen world like a slow river of footsteps. And above them, the sky stayed pale and cold. The winter was spreading, and the long road south had only just begun. Far to the south, the sea was rising. It had begun weeks earlier, though few had noticed at first. Storms had always battered the coast. High tides had always pushed water into the streets. But this was different. The storms did not leave. Wind moved across the ocean day and night, driving long gray waves toward the shore. The water climbed higher with each tide. Storm drains filled. Streets near the beach turned into shallow rivers. At first, people said it was only a bad season. But the tide kept coming. Along the long coast, the sea pushed through broken seawalls and across empty boulevards. Cars that had once been parked along the waterfront began to float slowly in place, bumping against curbs and one another. Salt water moved through the city. It filled parking garages and basements first. Then it crept into the lower floors of buildings. Elevators stopped working. Power failed along whole sections of the shoreline. Still, the waves came. The wind drove them harder each day. The ocean had grown restless in the cold. Scientists said the storms were being fed by the new ice spreading across the northern oceans. Cold air rushing south met warm currents rising from deep water. The sky above the sea twisted itself into endless storms. But the people living along the coast did not speak of science. They watched the water. From their balconies, they saw the streets disappear beneath gray foam. Traffic lights blinked over dark water. Palm trees bent in the wind while waves crashed against their trunks. The ocean had moved into the city. One morning, the tide rose higher than before. A line of waves rolled across the beachfront road and did not fall back. Water spread through the intersections and between the towers. It pushed debris along with it: wood, glass, broken signs, pieces of old fences. Cars began to drift. Some spun slowly in circles as the current pulled them toward the sea again. Others became trapped between buildings where the water deepened. A bus lay half submerged near a corner cafe. Its windows were dark and the door hung open beneath the water. No one came for it. People had already begun to leave. The evacuation orders had come late. Roads inland were already crowded with vehicles from colder regions farther north. Some coastal residents tried to drive away, but the highways were jammed with traffic. Others stayed too long. They believed the storms would pass the way storms always had. But the sea kept climbing. Wind howled through the narrow spaces between the tall buildings. Rain mixed with spray and filled the air with a gray mist that blurred the horizon. The beach vanished entirely. Where sand had once stretched wide and bright, there was only water now, rolling against the concrete foundations of towers built too close to the sea. On the far end of the waterfront, a small fishing boat had broken loose from its moorings. It drifted slowly through the flooded boulevard and struck a line of parked cars. The hull cracked against metal. Then the waves pulled it away again. The storm clouds above the city were thick and low. Sunlight fought its way through them in pale yellow bands that touched the tops of the towers but never reached the water below. The lower streets were dark. From high above, the coastline looked broken. Cars floated through intersections like scattered leaves. Pieces of docks and wooden walkways turned slowly in the current. In some places, the sea had pushed 3 blocks inland. The tide was still rising. Far out on the water, the horizon had disappeared beneath the storm. Waves climbed and fell like slow mountains moving through gray light. The ocean was larger than the city, and now it was inside it. People gathered in the upper floors of the towers and watched the streets disappear. They listened to the wind slam against the glass and to the dull, crashing sound of waves striking the buildings below. Some still hoped the water would fall back with the tide, but it did not. The sea had found the land, and it was not finished yet. From space, the Earth looked different now. The satellites, still circling above the planet, sent back images every few hours. Most of the networks that once received them had gone silent, but a handful of research stations and military facilities still listened. Their screens filled with the same picture again and again. White. The northern half of the world had turned pale beneath the sun. Ice stretched across Canada and down through the plains of the United States. The Great Lakes had vanished beneath a single frozen sheet that reflected the morning light like dull metal. Across the Atlantic, the same white spread across Europe. The rivers had stopped moving. The forests were buried beneath snow that had not melted in weeks. Even the mountains looked different. Their peaks no longer stood above the snow. They were simply part of it. In orbit, the satellites passed over the frozen continents every 90 minutes. Their cameras recorded the slow growth of the ice fields and the dimming of the oceans beneath clouds of constant storms. Scientists watched the images in quiet rooms lit by blue screens. No one spoke much anymore. The models had been wrong. At first, they believed the cold would remain seasonal, a violent winter followed by recovery in the spring. The atmosphere had behaved strangely before. It always corrected itself. But the correction never came. Instead, the ice spread faster. A chain reaction had begun somewhere deep in the planet's climate. Snow reflected sunlight back into space. The colder air allowed more snow to fall. Ocean currents slowed beneath the growing ice sheets. The Earth was losing heat, and the sun looked smaller each day. From orbit, the oceans appeared darker than before. Vast storms churned across their surfaces. The clouds stretched thousands of miles, wrapping around the planet in spirals that never broke apart. Lightning flashed deep within them. Beneath the storms, the water cooled. Ice formed first in the northern seas. Then it crept southward along the coasts. Shipping routes vanished beneath thick floating plates that crushed hulls and trapped vessels where they stood. Entire fleets were lost that way. Not to war, just to ice. Across the planet's cities dimmed. The satellites could see it clearly at night. Where bright constellations of electric light had once filled the continents, there were now wide regions of darkness. Power plants had shut down. Fuel deliveries had stopped. The lights were going out. Still the sun rose. It climbed slowly over the curve of the earth and spread thin light across the frozen land. The rays struck the ice sheets and scattered into space again, pale and cold. The planet looked bright, but it was not warm. From high orbit, the outline of North America was almost entirely white now. Only the southern coasts remained dark where the sea still moved freely. But even there, storms had begun to cover the land with frost. The ice was coming. Far below the satellites, people continued moving south across frozen highways and flooded coasts. Their footsteps left thin tracks that vanished with the next snowfall or tide. From space, those movements were invisible. The planet looked calm. It turned slowly beneath the sun, as it had for billions of years. Clouds drifted across the oceans. The night moved across the continents. But something had changed. The balance that held the world steady had begun to tilt. Scientists studying the data could see the pattern clearly now. Temperature curves dropping across every latitude. Ocean heat disappearing into expanding ice. Atmospheric circulation collapsing into massive frozen air masses. The planet was entering a new age, not one that humans had ever known. The Earth had been warm for the whole span of human civilization. Farms had grown in temperate valleys. Rivers had flowed freely from mountain glaciers that melted each spring. That time was ending. The satellites continued their silent orbit above the whitening world. Every 90 minutes, they watched the same slow transformation. More ice, more darkness, more silence spreading across the continents. And far below them, on the frozen surface of the earth, the people who still remained were only beginning to understand how large the winter had become. Some cities were still awake. Not many. But a few remained alive beneath the winter. They glowed faintly in the darkness of the frozen world, small islands of electricity surrounded by silent land. Power plants burned their last reserves of fuel. Backup reactors hummed deep beneath government complexes. Data centers ran on diesel generators that coughed smoke into the cold night air. Inside those cities, the lights still burned, and the networks still spoke. Across one such city, towers of glass and steel rose into the dark sky. Thousands of windows glowed with warm yellow light. Offices that once held accountants and lawyers were now filled with engineers, scientists, and operators, working without sleep. The machines had become more important than the buildings. In rooms filled with screens, streams of data moved across the walls. Temperature curves, ice maps, satellite telemetry, shipping losses, crop failures, power grid stability, population movement, numbers everywhere. The world had turned into a system that had to be measured constantly, because no one understood how fast it was breaking. At the center of the city stood a building that had once been a financial headquarters. Its marble lobby was empty now, but the upper floors were filled with humming servers and glowing monitors. The place had become a command center. From here, a small group of analysts watched the planet. They tracked the ice. Every hour, the white zones spread farther south across the maps. Canada had disappeared first, then the northern United States. Europe followed quickly after that. Now the frost lines were creeping into regions that had not seen snow in centuries. Agricultural belts were collapsing. Food shipments had slowed to almost nothing. The models predicted famine. But the models had predicted other things too, and most of them had been wrong. So the analysts watched the data instead. Across the giant screens, the movement of people appeared as shifting clusters of dots. Millions moving south across continents. Millions more fleeing flooded coasts. The maps looked alive. Cities that once held 10 million people were now nearly empty. Others had swollen with refugees until the infrastructure collapsed under the weight. The systems tried to adjust. Digital networks rerouted shipments that no longer existed. Automated trading algorithms still calculated economic growth for markets that had closed weeks earlier. The world's financial brain was still thinking. But the body had stopped moving. A young technician stood near the main screen and studied a graph of global temperature. The curve dropped steadily downward like a long, slow fall. He had been watching it for days. There was no sign it would stop. Behind him, rows of analysts worked quietly at their stations. Their faces were pale from the glow of the monitors. Coffee cups stood empty beside keyboards. Nobody talked much anymore. There was too much to watch. Outside the building, the city stretched into the night. The streets were mostly empty now, but the towers still held life. Generators rumbled in basements. Lights burned in high windows where people gathered around heaters and radios. From the rooftops, antennas still reached into the sky. Signals moved between them. The global internet had fractured weeks earlier when undersea cables failed and power grids collapsed, but fragments of the network still survived. Satellite relays carried bursts of information between the remaining cities. Short messages, weather updates, food inventories, requests for evacuation, warnings. The networks were no longer fast or smooth, but they were still alive. On one screen, the technician watched a series of blinking dots that represented active communication hubs around the world. Each one was a city still holding together. New York, London, Tokyo, Singapore, a few scattered places in South America and Australia. But the lights were going out. One by one, the signals faded as power systems failed or populations abandoned the cities. When a node vanished from the map, it did not return. Another light disappeared while he watched. The technician leaned closer to the screen. The signal from Moscow blinked twice and then went dark. No one said anything. They simply marked it in the log. The city outside the windows still glowed. Cars moved slowly along a few main streets where snow had not yet fallen. Helicopters circled the skyline carrying supplies between buildings. But everyone inside the command center knew the truth. Their city would not last forever either. Fuel was running low. Supply chains had shattered. Soon the generators would go quiet. The technician looked again at the map of the world. White covered most of it now. Storms turned across the oceans like giant wheels. Migration routes stretched across continents in thin, desperate lines. The systems kept recording everything. Every number, every signal, every last piece of information about a civilization trying to understand its own collapse. Outside, in the cold dark of the planet, the winter continued to grow. Not every place froze. Far from the great cities and the collapsing coastlines, there were valleys where the air stayed mild and the rivers still moved. The winter reached them slowly, like a distant rumor carried down the mountains. In those places, the world had grown quieter long before the storms began. One such valley lay between two long ridges of stone that rose blue in the morning light. A river curved through the land and spread into small channels that fed a patchwork of fields. The water never stopped moving there. Even when the nights turned cold, the river flowed dark and steady beneath thin layers of mist. The soil beside it stayed soft enough to work. People had farmed that valley for hundreds of years, perhaps longer. Rows of stone markers stood along the ridge above the fields. They had been placed there by people who lived long before the modern world. No one remembered exactly what they meant anymore, but they had never been moved. The farmers still worked beneath them. Small plots of vegetables grew in careful squares bordered by low walls of rock. Water ran through narrow irrigation channels that carried the river across the fields. In the early morning, the surface of the pools reflected the sky like pieces of glass. When the sun rose, the mist lifted slowly. A few dozen families lived in the valley now. Some had always been there. Others had arrived in the months since the winter began. They came down from the mountains or from distant roads where the migrating crowds had passed. Most stayed. The valley still had water. It still had soil. That was enough. The people worked quietly. They turned the earth with simple tools and planted crops that could grow in cooler air. Beans, greens, roots that buried themselves deep where frost could not reach. They did not speak much about the cities. Some had seen them before they left. Towers without heat, streets filled with abandoned cars, stores emptied of food. Others had heard only rumors carried by travelers who passed through. It did not matter. The valley had its own rhythm now. At dawn, the farmers walked down the paths between the fields. The air smelled of damp soil and river water. Birds still moved through the trees along the banks. Life continued there in small, careful ways. Children carried buckets from the irrigation pools. Old men repaired the stone walls that separated the gardens. Women knelt beside rows of seedlings and pressed the soil gently around their roots. No machines worked in the valley. Fuel had become too rare for that. Everything was done with hands. At night, the sky above the valley was clear and wide. Without the lights of distant cities, the stars seemed brighter than they had ever been before. They moved slowly across the darkness in long, silent arcs. Sometimes streaks of light crossed the sky, old satellites burning as they fell back to Earth. The people watched them without speaking. The modern world had once filled their lives with noise and movement. Planes crossing the sky, radios speaking from every house, trucks bringing food from distant places. Now there was only the river and the wind, and the soil beneath their feet. The cold was still spreading across the planet. Snow was creeping farther south each month. Storms were tearing apart the coasts and freezing the northern plains. But the valley had time. The mountains around it softened the worst of the winds. The river carried warmth from distant hills where snow melted slowly beneath the sun. It might not last forever. But for now, the land still gave food. One morning, a traveler arrived from the north. He walked into the valley along the river road carrying a worn pack on his shoulders. Frost clung to his coat, though the air there was mild compared to where he had come from. The farmers watched him from the fields. He moved slowly as if he had been walking for many weeks. When he reached the first stone wall, he stopped and looked across the green squares of growing plants. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he sat down beside the path and closed his eyes. The valley was quiet except for the sound of water moving through the irrigation channels. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. The traveler listened to the river. And for the first time in many days, he believed the world might still have places where life could continue. The traveler stayed in the valley. At first, he slept for a long time. The farmers gave him a place beside the river where the ground was warm enough to lie upon and the wind did not reach. They gave him bread made from the last harvest and a bowl of beans cooked slowly over a fire. He ate without speaking. His hands trembled when he held the bowl. No one asked him many questions. People in the valley had learned that those who came from the north carried too many memories already. After a few days he began to work. He helped clear stones from the fields and carried water from the irrigation channels. His strength returned slowly. The frost left his bones. One evening he climbed the hill above the valley. From there he could see the whole place, spread out beneath the fading light. The river curved through the land like a dark ribbon. Small fires burned beside the houses where people cooked their meals. Beyond the valley, the mountains rose in long, quiet ridges. The sky above them was clear. When night came, the stars appeared slowly, one by one. Without the lights of cities, the sky seemed deeper than he remembered. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness like a pale river of dust. The traveler sat beside the old stone markers that stood along the ridge. They were worn smooth by centuries of wind. No one living in the valley knew who had placed them there or why. They had stood longer than any building the traveler had ever seen, longer than the cities. Below him, the valley grew quiet as the fires burned low. Only the sound of the river moved through the darkness. He looked up again at the sky. Something about it felt different now. In the north, the stars appeared sharper and colder than before. The air itself seemed thinner, as if the world had drawn a slow breath and never released it. Above the horizon, several bright planets hung in the darkness. They looked close, closer than they should have. The traveler watched them carefully. During his long walk south, he had spent many nights under the open sky. He had learned to read the stars in the quiet hours when sleep would not come, and he knew when something had shifted. The lines of the constellations were the same. The stars had not moved, but the planets had. Their paths crossed the sky in strange arcs that did not match the old patterns he remembered. One burned red like a distant coal. Another shone pale and cold above the mountains. They seemed to follow each other, as if they were drawing invisible lines through the night. Far below the ridge, the farmers were lighting their evening fires. Small orange flames flickered across the valley like scattered stars upon the earth. The traveler remained beside the ancient stones. He traced the sky slowly with his eyes. For thousands of years, people had looked up from places like this and tried to understand the heavens. The old civilizations had built temples and towers aligned with the movement of planets and stars. They believed the sky carried messages, warnings, cycles of time that returned again and again. The traveler thought about the frozen cities far to the north, the spreading ice, the storms across the oceans. He thought about the strange cold that had taken hold of the planet. Then he looked again at the sky. The planets continued their silent motion. Thin lines of starlight stretched across the darkness as old satellites burned high in the atmosphere. Their brief trails faded quickly, leaving the heavens unchanged. But the traveler watched the paths of the planets, and the more he watched, the less certain he became that the winter had begun on Earth alone. A wind moved softly across the ridge. Below him, the valley slept beside the river. Crops grew quietly in their stone-bordered fields. Children dreamed in houses warmed by small fires. Life continued in the small places that still held warmth. But above the mountains, the sky turned slowly with the movement of worlds. The traveler remained beside the ancient stones until dawn began to touch the eastern horizon. And when the first pale light reached the valley, he was still watching the sky. Before the winter came, there had been a belief. It was quiet at first, but it spread through the world like a kind of promise. People believed the machines they had built could solve any problem the planet might give them. There were enough of them. Towers of steel rose from fields where the wind never stopped blowing. Their blades turned slowly against the sky and pulled electricity from the air. Solar farms stretched across deserts where the sun burned all day. Rivers carried turbines deep beneath the water. And beyond all of that were the great cities of industry. Factories that burned coal and gas. Refineries that turned black oil into motion. Power stations that lit whole continents through wires stretched across mountains and oceans. The machines had become the skeleton of civilization. For a long time they worked well. A river wound through the green countryside where one of those systems had been built. Wind turbines stood across the fields like tall white trees. Their blades turned slowly above farms and villages. Electric lines ran from tower to tower across the land. Far beyond the fields, a city of factories rose beneath a heavy sky. Smoke moved from the chimneys and spread across the clouds in long gray streaks. It had once meant prosperity. The farms grew grain. The factories built machines. The turbines fed electricity into the grid that powered the homes and trains and ports that connected everything together. It was a system that fed itself. Until the winter began. At first the machines tried to hold the world together. The turbines still turned. The power plants burned their fuel harder. Engineers worked day and night to keep the grid stable while the storms spread across the continents. Electricity became the last defense against the cold. Heaters ran without pause. Pumps kept water moving through frozen pipes. Satellites guided shipments of food toward cities that were already starving. For a while it worked. But the machines depended on one thing the winter destroyed: stability. The ice storms began breaking the lines that carried power across the land. Towers collapsed beneath the weight of frozen cables. Roads disappeared beneath snowdrifts that trucks could no longer cross. Fuel stopped arriving. Maintenance crews could not reach the turbines when their blades froze solid in the northern winds. The system began to fracture. In the countryside, the great white turbines still turned for a time. Their slow motion continued long after the cities beyond them had gone dark. But there was nowhere for the electricity to go. Substations failed. Transmission lines snapped. The grid that had once connected millions of machines across continents broke apart into silent pieces. In the industrial cities, the power plants ran until their last reserves of fuel were gone. Smoke rose into the gray sky until the fires inside the furnaces finally died. The factories went still. The turbines continued turning above the empty fields, their blades sweeping slowly through the cold air. But no lights came on in the houses below them. The villages along the river grew quiet. People gathered wood for fires again. They worked the land with tools that did not depend on power lines or distant machines. The towers of industry remained on the horizon. Tall chimneys stood above the silent factories like monuments to another age. The buildings still held the machines that had once made steel, engines, computers, aircraft. But the machines were quiet now. Without power and without the network that connected them to the rest of the world, they had become useless shapes of metal. The turbines continued turning. They would turn for years in the wind. But the world they had once powered had already begun to disappear. Across the countryside, the river moved slowly toward the sea. Villages stood beside it, where people had returned to simpler work. Fields were planted by hand. Fires burned in chimneys at night. Far beyond them, the silent factories waited beneath a sky filled with slow gray clouds. The machines had tried to hold civilization together. But the winter had been stronger than the system built to stop it. As the machines failed and the cities emptied, the land began to change. At first it happened quietly. Roads that once carried thousands of vehicles each day fell silent. Snow gathered in the lanes and remained there. Grass pushed through cracks in the pavement where no tires rolled anymore. Forests crept closer. Animals moved where people had once lived. The highways and rail lines had cut across the wilderness for generations. They had divided forests and valleys into small pieces of land where the wild things had learned to stay away. But when the traffic stopped, the wilderness began to return. Deer appeared first. They moved cautiously through abandoned suburbs where gardens had turned into open fields. Wolves followed soon after, thin from the long winter but patient as always. The forests grew darker. Without logging crews and roads filled with trucks, the trees thickened across the hills. Fallen branches and old trunks piled high where no one cleared them away. Paths disappeared beneath moss and brush, and deeper in those forests, other shapes began to move. The traveler from the valley heard stories about them long before he ever saw one. Hunters who had come down from the northern woods spoke in low voices beside the fires. They described large tracks in the snow where no roads existed anymore. Tracks shaped like a man's footprint, but larger. Some said they belonged to people who had gone wild during the collapse, men who had learned to live beyond the reach of farms and villages. Others believed something older had returned. Creatures that had lived in the forests before the modern world pushed them into the mountains and the deepest valleys. Most people did not believe the stories. Until one winter evening when a hunter returned from the woods with a face pale as frost. He had been tracking deer across the frozen hills when the forest grew quiet around him. Even the wind seemed to stop moving between the trees. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, heavy. He turned. At the edge of the trees, a figure stood watching him. It was taller than any man he had ever seen. Thick fur hung from its shoulders like a dark cloak. Its face was hidden beneath shadow and hair, but its eyes caught the light of the dying sun. The hunter did not raise his rifle. Something in the way the creature stood made him hesitate. It did not move like prey. It did not move like an animal. The figure stepped forward once. The snow beneath its feet made a deep sound, heavier than any deer or wolf could make. In its hand it carried a tool shaped like an old axe, though the metal blade was dark with rust. For a moment the hunter believed he was looking at something impossible, a man, and not a man. Then the figure turned slowly and disappeared back into the forest. The hunter waited until night fell before he moved again. When he returned to the valley, he told the others what he had seen. Some laughed quietly. Others did not. Over the months that followed, more signs appeared along the edges of the forest. Strange footprints in the snow. Trees cut cleanly with blades no one had seen before. Fires burning in distant hills where no villages existed. The wilderness was growing again, but it was not empty. On a cold morning late in the winter, a shepherd walking along the ridge above the valley saw movement between the trees. A figure stepped from the forest and paused at the edge of the field. It stood still for a long time. The shepherd could see its shape clearly against the pale sky. A massive form wrapped in furs and leather. A cloak of dark animal hide hung from its shoulders. In its hand it held an axe. The figure watched the valley quietly. Then it turned and walked back into the forest. The shepherd said nothing when he returned to the village. But that night, as the fires burned low and the wind moved through the trees, the people of the valley understood something had changed again. The old world had fallen. The machines had gone silent, and beyond the fields where the last farms survived, the wilderness was returning, along with whatever had once lived inside it. In the end, the winter did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like silence. Across the world, the cold moved slowly, steadily, until there were fewer and fewer places left where the earth stayed warm enough for people to live as they once had. The oceans froze, first in the far north. Then the ice crept southward year by year. Storms hardened into seasons that no longer ended. The maps that once showed countries and borders meant nothing anymore. There were only warm places and cold ones. Many valleys like the one by the river survived for a time. The people there planted their crops carefully and guarded their water. They built stone walls against the wind and learned again how to live without the machines that had once carried the world forward. But the cold continued. Snow began falling even in places where winter had once been mild. The mountains held the frost longer each year. The rivers slowed beneath growing ice. The traveler stayed in the valley for several years. He helped plant the fields and rebuild the irrigation channels. He told stories of the cities that had once filled the northern plains with light. The children listened to him as if he were describing another planet. In many ways, he was. Because the old world had already disappeared. The machines rusted where they stood. The factories filled slowly with snow and vines. The turbines still turned in distant fields, though there was no one left to hear their blades moving in the wind. The sky grew colder. Even the stars seemed sharper than before. The traveler continued to climb the ridge at night where the ancient stones stood. He watched the planets move across the sky in their slow, strange paths. He believed something beyond the earth had begun the change. A shift in the quiet clockwork of the heavens. But no one could stop it. Years passed. The valley endured longer than most places. The river still flowed beneath the mountains and the soil still produced food. But eventually the cold reached even there. Snow came earlier each autumn and remained longer in the spring. The crops grew smaller. The nights turned bitter. People began to leave again. This time there was nowhere left to walk toward. Some traveled south in hope of finding warmer lands. Others climbed into the mountains where caves and stone shelters might hold heat longer than open valleys. Many simply stayed where they were, because every place had become the same, a slow world of frost. Long after the traveler grew old, he walked one final time to the ridge above the valley. The ancient stones were half buried in snow now. Below him, the river moved quietly through a land that had grown pale and still. Few fires burned in the valley anymore. Most of the houses stood empty. The traveler sat beside the stones and watched the sky. The stars moved in their endless arcs. The planets followed their silent paths. The cold moon hung low above the mountains like a pale lantern. The sky had always been there, long before the cities, long before the machines, and it would remain long after. The traveler closed his eyes and listened to the wind move across the frozen land. The world had not ended. It had only changed. Civilizations had come and gone before. Forests had risen where deserts once stood. Ice had covered the continents and retreated again. The earth was patient. Far beyond the mountains, the frozen oceans stretched beneath the pale light of the moon. The great storms had quieted now, leaving only vast fields of ice beneath the endless sky. The planet had grown still, but not dead. Somewhere beneath the snow seeds remained in the soil. Rivers still moved beneath frozen surfaces. Small pockets of warmth endured in valleys and deep caves where life waited quietly. One day, perhaps centuries from now, the cold might begin to retreat. The ice would melt. The rivers would grow strong again, and new people might walk across the land, wondering about the ruins buried beneath the earth. The traveler opened his eyes once more and looked at the stars. Then he stood slowly and walked down from the ridge into the quiet valley below. Behind him, the ancient stones remained beneath the winter sky, watching, as they always had,